So I'm here, before I start, if you're here to find out about that funny photograph, you're going to have to wait till the end. So, I'm here to basically talk about my work on a new UN treaty to deal with areas beyond national jurisdiction. So my particular aspect or expertise on this treaty is to do with marine genetic resources. So what are the areas beyond national jurisdiction? 64% of the ocean and 43% of the Earth's surface is beyond sovereign territories. So that's even beyond the EEZ territories, which is in light blue. So all of this bit that you see in dark blue, bright blue, is or comprises what's called areas beyond national jurisdiction or high seas. And obviously, if there is no sovereign territory over these areas, the question of management of those resources, including things like deep sea bed mining, navigation, cable laying, all of these things are issues, fraught issues that need to be managed. The BBNJ treaty, which is biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, has 4 elements to it. A couple of them are to do with environmental issues, and 2 of them, capacity building and technology transfer and marine genetic resources, sort of comes under what I work on. So how did we get here? Why was there a need for a new treaty like this? And I think to understand why this treaty negotiation is so contentious, there are a number of different historic legal arcs that sort of converge on this particular point. So just very quickly, so in 1980 we had the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which seems quite dated now, but the principles there, many of them come from customary international law, and therefore countries that want to follow these principles are very, very devoted and very, very attached to them. 1992 we had the Convention on Biological Diversity, and you'll remember perhaps from the news, in December 2022 we had something called the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is in a manner of speaking, an update to the 1992 convention. 94, the TRIPS agreement, and those of you here from the Law Department should have heard the term. It's an international agreement on intellectual property rights. 2000, we finished the Human Genome Project. Why is that important? It's important because along the process of completing the Human Genome Project, or sequencing the human genome, we understood that genomic studies, large-scale genomic studies, are incredibly important for biodiscovery and innovation. 2014, we signed the Nagoya Protocol, which was a sort of implementing protocol for the Convention on Biological Diversity, but they missed something out. They missed our digital sequence information. So any physical genetic resources, the samples that are then sequenced and can circulate in information form after extremely controversial, contentious negotiations, did not feature in the Nagoya Protocol, which was what was updated in 2022. So we've had dither and delay for a number of years. 2018, the treaty negotiations started. We're now currently in what the UN would like to call the decade of ocean science for sustainable development, and therefore the impact of the BBNJ agreement is very likely to continue along the whole decade. So just in terms of the pressure point, if you imagine the BBNJ agreement sort of right here, the kind of sort of legal pressures that come include from customary law, customary international law, where freedom of the high seas, so navigating in the high seas is a freedom that is allowed to all sovereign nations. The question is, does that freedom include the right to conduct scientific research on the high seas? Because the scientific research is applied on a tangible thing, which is the marine genetic resources. So the freedom to do an activity cannot extend to disposing of that tangible resource in any way that you want, which is where something called the common heritage of mankind comes in. So there are a lot of good arguments to be made from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that genetic resources should remain common heritage of mankind. In the meantime, over the last 20 years, we've seen an exponential growth, if you like, of the kinds of intellectual property rights that can be given over biological matter. And we've also seen increasing quantities of sequence data being stored and used, and clearly these are resources of some considerable value. Territorial rights come into play because of indigenous groups' rights. Do indigenous and local communities that live in coastal areas that are adjacent to some of these high seas territories, and what would adjacent mean? What kind of rights do they have on the use of these genetic resources? And then a huge part of the last 20 years post the conventional biological diversity is something called access and benefit sharing. So the conventional biological diversity gives sovereign rights to plant and animal genetic resources to countries where these genetic resources exist. In order to access that, as a foreign researcher, if you want to access these genetic resources, you have to enter into an agreement with that country. Now, this sort of bilateral arrangement where you would need an agreement for every country that you enter into is now, I think, there's consensus that they lead to very burdensome regulations. And we've been dealing with that over the last 20 years. And then there's this big move towards universalizing access to data. If genomic data is made available freely to low and middle income countries, for instance, you will immediately see an increase in biodiscovery and innovation that relies on access to that. So this is a sort of technical, if you like, emerging scenario. And the BBNJ agreement and the articles that deal with marine genetic resources sit right in that circle, facing all of these pressures. Politically, we're seeing what is known, what a group of scientists in a paper in 2020 called the Blue Acceleration, which is an increasing drive, a race among diverse and often competing interests for ocean food, material, and space. So given that political environment, what do we make of who conducts research in areas beyond national jurisdiction? Now there's a huge technological gap. So basically these negotiations are between about 8 to 10 countries that engage in marine genetic research on the high seas and the rest of the world, in effect. And if you look at these, some of this data which was presented, I was lead author for a paper report that was written for the Ocean Panel, which was a 13 country panel led by Norway and Fiji, where they commissioned a number of reports on what marine scientific research looks like currently and what it would look like on the high seas. So 98% of patents citing marine genes are filed by researchers or companies in 10 countries. That covers all of the oceans, not just ABNJ. And if you look here, scientific publications mostly come from a handful of countries. So conducting research on the high seas is very expensive. Not every country can do it, and not every country has the capacity to even start doing it in 10 years' time. Given this technological gap, what is any equitable agreement on how we manage these resources seek to achieve? What do we want to see today in order that the next 10, 20 years would see this gap, technological gap, narrow, and would also see an equitable sharing of benefits that come from this kind of research? So my grant and my work this is an extract from the UN General Assembly resolution in 2017, which called for these negotiations to begin. So marine genetic resources, including questions on the sharing of benefits. So given the political pressure, given the emerging scientific and legal sort of ecosystem, what are we going to do with these genetic resources beyond national territories? And remember, only about 10% of entire biodiversity in the oceans is known. We only know of only about 10% of it. So about 90% of it is yet to be studied. Why is this? It's also particularly important because many areas in ABNJ involve biodiversity that are extremophiles. That is, So if you find organisms at great depth, these are organisms that can survive cold and intense pressure, or sometimes heat if they're found in geothermal vents. And there is a real possibility that we might be able to use those genetic traits, for instance, for climate resilience, for building climate resilience into our crops. So if you have a genetic trait that can withstand rising temperatures, introducing that into a rice or a wheat crop might give you the possibility of growing something under drought-like conditions. It's not just that, the possibility of antivirals, antibacterials. So a lot of researchers are very, very excited about this, the possibilities from the use of these new genetic resources. Okay, so my own path to come to this work has been long. I won't say torturous, but has been long. I had an EPA, I think I hold the first EPSRC grant at the LSE, which is the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. An interesting grant which is about discipline hopping. So I was able to spend a year just learning synthetic biology at Imperial, which was an amazing opportunity. I then had a Horizon 2020 grant where we did some work on the Nagoya Protocol and marine genetic resources. And then I was part of a study for the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I was one of 4 lead authors, where we did a worldwide fact-based study on how many countries actually include digital sequence information when it comes to access and benefit sharing from genetic resources. Remember, the convention and the Nagoya Protocol don't include sequence information. So we have that information, and then my day job, if you like, is to teach and research on patent law. So there is a bit of serendipity in how all of these factors came together in the project in 2018. And then I was called on by the Office of the Pacific Ocean Commissioner, which they work like a secretariat for the Pacific small island developing states, so nations like Fiji, Vanuatu, Samoa, Solomon Islands. And as advisor for them, I attended Intergovernmental Conference 2 and 3. And lately, I'm working as an expert on the G77 plus China chairs team. Now, why am I not an advisor for the G77 plus China? Because it's very political to have a single expert who will speak for all the groups. So one way of dealing with that is to be an expert on the chairs team. The chair, convenes these issues. This was the Horizon 2020 grant in Mari. That was the project, and they've had a number of successes. Lots of patents filed, lots of spin-off companies, and they've done really well. And I was the sort of legal lead on that project. Okay, now I'm going to go into the actual treaty. I even have a puzzle for you. It will take about 3 or 4 minutes. Some of the issues include use of terms. Use of terms is where you define the terminology for a treaty. Do we include digital sequence information or not? Now, given the sort of history of the legal ecosystem, you would think that this would be a no-brainer. That any wealthy country that wanted an equitable treaty would include digital sequence information. But we're still fighting this battle. There is no agreement on that. In the negotiations that are going to begin in February, we've put forward a proposal. We'll see if that gets taken up. There's a lot of pressure now, given that the December CBD decisions have already said that digital sequence information should become part of how you share monetary benefits. There's an interesting case of agenda setting that goes on here. So the president of the negotiations comes up with a draft text that's an aid to the negotiations. Up until the first 2 versions, we had the common heritage of mankind in the draft text, which then disappeared from the text. Obviously, not without comment, and a lot of people are quite annoyed about that, so February is going to be interesting, is all I can say. And then it's about monetary and non-monetary benefits. How are we going to share the monetary and non-monetary benefits from this? Now, non-monetary benefits is a little easier to agree because we have had a lot of developments in the ethics of scientific research. When you conduct a research project, your grant money might include conditions on how the results of that must be made openly available. Since we've had those kinds of developments, it's still a negotiation, it's still a fight, but that's a little bit easier than monetary benefits. How are we going to share the money, if any, that might be made from commercialization of these resources? The key elements include 10 to 13, Articles 10 to 13. Article 12 is about intellectual property rights, but I'm not going to go into that. But basically, this is the narrative in these articles. There's a ship, presumably, because you have to go to areas beyond national jurisdiction. You collect the marine genetic resources, and then you sequence it and you use it. Sequencing also comes under the definition of use. And then you might upload it into a database. Then the question is, what obligations do those databases have to make that information available? What obligations do the users have to make the products of this commercialization or utilization available? And then if products are made, but remember, it's not often the case that you take a single sample and convert it into a product. Often your products will have genetic sequences from multiple sources. So this is a tricky question. But in all of these questions, it's often the case that claims of technical impossibility often mask political willingness to do or to take on certain legal obligations. So as expert on this work, part of my job is to bring that interdisciplinary understanding, to tease out where it's technically feasible to do something and where it's possible to frame the legal obligation in a legally certain way. Right? So legal certainty is also important. Another hot button topic is, for a lot of wealthy countries, they do not want their researchers to face burdensome regulations. That's a little difficult. What is burdensome? If you are engaging in areas beyond national jurisdiction and you're dealing with these marine genetic resources, then arguably you do naturally take on some obligations as part of that. There have been a number of outputs. I just put this out because it came out literally 2 days ago. This is the first policy brief where I have collaborated with two colleagues. They're not at the LSE, although Paul, looking very dapper with his hat there, did do a LSE anthropology PhD. And Claudio is an expert on the implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this brief analyzes what happened in December on the Convention on Biological Diversity and suggests what sort of a roadmap it provides for the BBNJ negotiations. Future work, and I think one way, I think it's, when you think of a KEI grant, you often think of it as coming at the end of a project. This is where your impact makes sense. But I have found this to be more like the middle than the end, because there are a number of strands of work that arise from this project, including theoretical normative work on, for instance, the status of marine genetic resources. And one thing that I have been noticing, it's not an area of expertise, but I'd want it to be, is how asymmetric negotiating capacities have an impact on what actually ends up in the treaty. So for instance, in August, when we finished IGC 5, the G77 chair had to make a very strong statement in the closing plenary, because towards the end, because everyone was so anxious to get the treaty done and dusted, the president allowed parallel negotiations, which meant that we had 4 different rooms where 4 different issues were being negotiated. Often, smaller countries will just have one person rushing like a headless chicken from one room to the other. So this favors delegations that are larger, that are better funded, have more experts and advisors on them. So very simple things like that, combined with agenda setting, sometimes in the text of what comes back, can have quite an impact on it. I guess, what is it like to be at the UN? Mostly, you see a lot of backs, because I'm sitting at the back of, this is G77 chair. So you're often sitting at the back. You're responding to things that come out from the floor. So there's a lot of WhatsApping. They've said this, we've got to rebut that, we've got to say this, we've got to defend that, or don't let that hang. Or X would say, I can't say that point, so send it to Sri Lanka to say. I'll just use that Sri Lanka as an example. So you're managing all of that sitting at the back when the negotiations are on. There's a lot of no food, lots of coffee, lots of coke, and there's literally one vending machine. This is not a joke. There's one vending machine. The cafe is all shut at 4 o'clock.
Oh.
We are there most days up to sort of 10, 11. And you could be queuing with the ambassador or the deputy permanent representative waiting for a coke can from the vending machine or a packet of plantain crisps, which I find are quite filling.
Mm-hmm.
So the 2 weeks tend to be quite intense, but we also get through a lot of work in those 2 weeks. And it's quite amazing how much you can get through when you when you shut the door and put everybody in one room. So some of it includes talking points that are prepared before the session, but most of it, to be honest, happens in the 48 hours in the lead up to it or during the actual negotiations, because the situation is very fluid and keeps moving. That's about 1/25 of me sitting behind the G77 chair. I put this picture up because if you want to Google this, Samoa, for instance, made a very emotional speech at the closing ceremony in August, where they said, we've spent about $250,000 to bring our team here to negotiate. Very sad that they couldn't finish the treaty. This is money that could not have been spent on schools and roads and all the things that they wanted to, and she was close to tears. So like I said, well-funded, larger delegations definitely have an advantage in these negotiations. And this brings me to what the lovely Louise has been managing for me. None of this work would be possible without the LSE's knowledge exchange and impact grant. It has allowed me to be there without being paid for by somebody, which means that I can remain independent, and it is a careful role to manage, because I have two roles. I have this independent academic from the LSE, but also if I'm working with the G77 chair, I am formulating G77 friendly positions. And that can be viewed, you can view that as advocacy. I don't think it's advocacy. I think it is about scholarship that's transformative and as ambition. You want the treaty to be equitable. How do you think that equitable language should be embedded in the treaty? So I have lots of thoughts about what it means for knowledge, for impact. I think expertise is very different from knowledge. The knowledge you have is not as important as the positioning that happens during these negotiations, because what you know is not the same as how you express it or how you persuade other parties to take up a particular position. And that photo of that was me scuba diving without knowing how to swim in 2018. If you look closely at the photo, you can see I'm being tethered by a rope. I think that the point I wanted to make by using that photo is that there are times when you're out of your depth. And you're out of your depth not because you don't know what's going on, but because things are moving so fast. And not all negotiators show all their hand at the start of the conversation, right? So you're constantly, and I think this is an advantage. When a situation is fluid, opportunities come up. And being present is about trying to understand where those opportunities lie and capitalizing on them. So yeah, it's been a really incredible project so far, and thank you very much to the KEI grant from the LSE. So 34, so questions? Sorry, taking a bit too long.
Thank you.